Although many of the more documented and relevant true crime cases are of recent history, that doesn't mean that there weren't equally sinister crimes being committed throughout human history. This video will discuss 5 different true crime cases that occurred during the early years of the United States. Despite occurring a few hundred years ago, these cases were startling and gruesome during their time. However, we would like to point out that a lot of accounts of older events were based on word of mouth and conflicting stories and not extensively documented. Not everything mentioned in this video can be verified as complete truth. We hope you enjoyed the video. Number 1. The murder of Eunice Bolles. On July 21, 1786, the body of 6-year-old Eunice Bolles was found just off a road that connected the towns of New London and Norwich, Connecticut. She was discovered by a passerby at around 10 a.m., who found Eunice against a rock wall with signs of extreme trauma on her body and large rocks from the wall on top of her. Initially, it was believed that the rock wall had collapsed on top of Eunice and crushed her. But after further investigation, it was discovered that someone had beaten and strangled Eunice before staging the crime scene to look like an accident. After questioning townsfolk around the area, investigators talked to Hannah Akiwish, a 12-year-old girl of mixed indigenous descent. The townsfolk had informed the investigators that around 5 weeks prior, Eunice had accused Hannah of stealing berries from a local strawberry patch. Once she was questioned, Hannah admitted she had seen Eunice with 4 suspicious-looking boys walking down the road where she was found dead. After coming up empty for any leads regarding the suspicious boys, investigators turned their attention to Hannah as the suspect. Not only did she have a strong motive, but Hannah's reputation throughout the towns of Norwich and New London were anything but good. Hannah Akiwish was born in March of 1774 in Norwich to a father of unknown descent and a mother who was part of either the local Pequot or Nehantic tribe. Not much is known about her mother other than she was a known drunk, described as an abandoned creature, much addicted to the vice of drunkenness. Hannah's mother was already drinking heavily throughout her pregnancy and later abandoned Hannah at a young age. Consequently, Hannah spent much of her childhood being passed between different foster homes and serving as an indentured servant throughout the 2 towns. She was frequently handed off between houses due to her growing reputation as a thief and a liar. She was once described as having a maliciousness of disposition, which made the children in the neighborhood much afraid of her. At the age of 6, she was accused of beating a Caucasian child in order to steal her necklace and clothes. Hannah's problems most likely stemmed from her mother's drunkenness during her pregnancy, as well as being passed around between different homes from a young age. Additionally, Hannah was also described as having an intellectual disability, which might have been caused by her mother's alcohol consumption during her pregnancy. Given her history of mischief and violence, as well as the discrimination that women and persons of color faced during the time period, it wasn't far-fetched for investigators to believe that Hannah was behind the murder of young Eunice Bolles. When questioned again by investigators, Hannah continued to deny her involvement. She was then forcefully taken to the house the Bolleses lived at, where Eunice's body was being kept. After catching sight of Eunice and being charged with her murder, Hannah burst into tears and admitted that she had killed Eunice. After further questioning, Hannah admitted she was seeking revenge against the young girl after she had accused Hannah of stealing strawberries. When she spotted Eunice walking to school, Hannah lured Eunice off the roads with the promise of calico, a type of cotton fabric. Once Eunice was out of sight from the road, Hannah beat her with a rock and strangled her before staging Eunice's body to look as if a rock wall had accidentally collapsed on her. After her confession, Hannah was taken to a jail nearby to await her trial. In the months leading up to her trial, Hannah was often visited by Reverend Henry Channing, who discovered Hannah had no knowledge of God nor the teachings of Christianity. He continued to preach to her in hopes she would repent, allowing her a better chance at her life being spared. But besides her initial breakdown when she was confronted, Hannah never showed any remorse for her actions. At her trial, Hannah was found guilty of killing Eunice rather quickly and sentenced to death by hanging. Seeming to not understand the weight of her actions, nor the consequence she would soon face, Hannah continued to show no remorse throughout her trial. Her lack of remorse was used against her during the trial, as even the judge who presided over the court stated that her crime outweighed any mental incapacity that she had. As she waited in jail for her execution date in December, visitors often stopped by Hannah's cell to ask her how many days she had left. Every time she was asked, Hannah would answer with agitation. It wasn't until December 19th, the day before her execution, that she wept throughout the day. On December 20th, the day of her execution, Hannah was led from the jail to the gallows where she was set to hang. Reverend Henry Channing delivered a sermon stating that Hannah was an example of what could happen if parents didn't raise their children to be dutiful and obedient. Additionally, he argued that Hannah's skin color had nothing to do with the crime she committed, but her actions were instead due to the failure of the human race. Hannah remained quiet throughout the event, but her eyes were reported to be gleaming with fear and crying for help. Before she was hanged, Hannah thanked the sheriff for his kindness. Once she was executed, Hannah Auchiwish became the youngest recorded person to be legally executed in America at 12 years and 9 months old. During the time period, people of color were far more likely to be hanged than Caucasians. African Americans were 9 times more likely to be hanged, and Native persons were twice as likely to be hanged than Caucasian people. Additionally, since the formation of the United States, over 300 children have been executed. The youngest of those children were all, unfortunately, people of color. As of 2020, the case of Hannah Auchiwish has been reopened by the New London chapter of the NAACP. The group plans to revisit the case as there are many conflicting pieces of information. Many have argued that Hannah was not given a fair trial as it was short and she was found guilty quickly thereafter. Some even believe that she might have been framed and forced into a confession. However, as far as colonial Americans were concerned, she did have 3 strikes against her. She was a woman, a person of color, and mentally handicapped. Number 2. JR-102C. On May 14, 1607, the first permanent English settlement was established by the Virginia Company on the shores of what would later be named Virginia. The settlement of around 100 members was named Jamestown after the current King of England, King James I. Like the failed colony of Roanoke, which settled nearby in 1585, the settlers faced famine, disease, and conflict with the local indigenous tribes. 2 years after its initial establishment, the winter of 1609 resulted in the majority of settlers to die during the starving time. Settlers turned to eating their pets, leather, and even their recently deceased neighbors in order to survive. But in the spring, an additional 150 settlers arrived to help the colony. After turning from mining for gold to building farms and better housing for the winter, the colony of Jamestown was able to grow. The colony lasted until 1698, when it was practically abandoned as additional settlements spread out over the area. In 1994, a team of archaeologists discovered the original colony of Jamestown and began to excavate it. Countless artifacts and structural footprints were found, as well as human bodies. 2 years later, in 1996, archaeologist William Kelso discovered the skeletal remains of a man with a musket ball lodged in his leg. After careful excavation, it was theorized that the skeleton was the victim of the first documented murder between 2 European settlers on American soil. When Kelso brought the skeletal remains to his lab for examination, he estimated that the man had been between 18 to 20 years old when he died. Kelso estimated that the man was about 5 foot 9 inches and had a strong upper body. It appeared that there hadn't been any attempts to remove the musket ball from his right leg, and the bone hadn't healed around the piece of lead at all. With how the musket ball was lodged in the bone, it most likely had ruptured a major artery, and the man bled out within minutes. The remains were found near the site of Jamestown's church tower, and the soil on top of it contained fragments of ceramics of both indigenous and European descent, dating to before the 1600s. This indicated that the body had been buried there in the early years of the settlement. Even with all this information, Kelso couldn't confirm the victim's identity or his exact cause of death. In 1998, after combing records from the settlement, Kelso theorized that the murder victim was a man named Stephen Calthrop. Stephen Calthrop was a 22-year-old man who was one of the first settlers of Jamestown. His date of death was recorded as being August 15, 1607, but his cause of death was kept concealed. Because of this, Kelso theorized that Stephen might have been a part of Captain John Smith's mutiny that took place before they arrived in Virginia. If this was the case, it would make sense why some settlers would have wanted Stephen Calthrop dead. Because Stephen served as a guardsman, someone might have shot him on the side of the leg while he stood on night watch. Archaeologists went one step further and reconstructed the victim's face. They found that the skull had excellent bone structure and white teeth. They hoped it would help to finalize the identity of the victim. 15 years later, in 2013, William Kelso's theory changed as he discovered new evidence of who the victim might be. Instead of the body being of 22-year-old Stephen Calthrop, Kelso discovered that the victim was most likely 19-year-old Lieutenant George Harrison. George was born in Hertford, England in 1605 and immigrated to the Jamestown colony, where he was around 13 in 1618. In March of 1624, it was recorded that a duel had taken place between George Harrison and the burgess of the settlement named Richard Stevens. Unfortunately, George had been the loser of the duel and ultimately met his demise. The records from the settlement indicated that George took a bullet in the leg and later died from it. It made more sense than the Stephen Calthrop theory, as George's cause of death had been documented and the musket ball was lodged in the side of the leg, which was how duelists normally stood during gunfights. His duel opponent, Richard Stevens, had actually cheated and used a musket ball that was normally used in combat. These rounds were used in rifles and not flintlocks, making this smaller gun almost as powerful as a rifle. Although he had cheated, Richard Stevens died a year later after engaging in a fistfight. As burgess, or the parliamentary representative assigned to a living settlement, he often argued with the governor, John Harvey. Harvey would have angry outbursts and once beat Richard Stevens with a cane that knocked out a few of his teeth. After Stevens' death in 1636, his wife Elizabeth married Governor John Harvey, his enemy. Number 3. The Zong Massacre. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, approximately 12.5 million Africans were sold from their homes and sold into slavery. These enslaved people were transported across the Atlantic Ocean, where they were forced to submit to terrible labor conditions. Because slave traders often wanted to maximize their profits during the trip across the ocean, ships took on far more slaves than they were capable of holding comfortably. Slaves were often packed tightly together in the cargo hold, unable to move for weeks at a time. Because of these risky conditions, oftentimes a portion of the slaves would pass away before they made it to the western continent of North America. But for a ship named Zong, their voyage proved to be extremely costly to the human lives they were transporting. On September 6, 1781, the Zong departed from Accra, Ghana, with a set course to Jamaica. Slaves were often needed in Jamaica to work on the sugar plantations, so to maximize profits, Captain Luke Collingwood boarded 470 slaves onto the Zong. This was around double what the Zong was capable of accommodating, but because slaves were so valuable, Captain Collingwood was willing to take the risk. 2 months after they set sail, tragedy struck the Zong. Captain Collingwood fell gravely ill early on, effectively leaving the ship without a captain. It is uncertain who took over command of the Zong, but Captain Collingwood remained bedridden for most of the journey. While passing Tobago, the Zong didn't stop in order to replenish their water supply. Instead, they continued on towards Jamaica. By November 29th, many on the Zong began to die from malnourishment and disease. The voyage was taking much longer than expected due to a navigational error. The crew had mistaken Jamaica for Saint-Domingue, which was later named Haiti. Their mistake proved to be fatal for many on board, as the Zong reached what was called the doldrums. The doldrums were an area around the equator where there was practically no wind. This area is where northeast and southeast trade winds converge, causing the wind to travel upwards. If a ship found themselves caught in this area, it often left it stranded for weeks as there was no wind to move the ship along. The Zong found itself in this unfortunate situation, causing 7 of the 17 crew members to perish along with over 50 slaves on board. Due to the delay and the ship's failure to stop in Tobago, the Zong soon ran low on water and other necessary supplies. In order to conserve supplies and save the rest of the crew, they began to throw slaves overboard to stagnate the loss of supplies. Once they arrived in Jamaica, the crew would claim the loss with the insurance they had on the slave cargo. Over the course of a week, the Zong crew threw approximately 132 slaves overboard. An additional 10 threw themselves overboard in an act of defiance. By the time the Zong finally arrived in Black River, Jamaica on December 22nd, there were only 208 enslaved people remaining on board. The owner of the Zong filed a claim with the insurance company for the loss, claiming the Zong didn't have enough water to sustain the crew and slaves that were transported. However, despite their dwindling supplies, there was still around 420 gallons of water on board when it was inventoried in Jamaica. After reviewing the case, the ruling went in favor of the Zong's owners. Shortly after, the insurance company appealed the case. When abolitionists in Great Britain began to hear of the incident, they were appalled by the loss of human lives. The event sparked further public awareness about the slave trade and recruited more abolitionists to protest against slavery. During the second trial, the insurers won the appeal. William Murray, who sat on the highest court in Britain and oversaw the trial, stated that the slaves had been poorly managed by the ill captain, and he should have ensured that everyone received enough water. Throwing the slaves overboard had been unnecessary, especially given how much water had still been on board when the ship was inventoried. For abolitionist Granville Sharp, this was not a harsh enough punishment, so he urged that Captain Collingwood and his crew be criminally charged with murdering the slaves they threw overboard. The justice who heard his plea denied his request. He stated that it was madness to accuse the men of murder, as the crew hadn't thrown human people overboard, but instead property. To the justice, the slaves were equivalent to the loss of horses and wood, not human lives. Many of European descent considered slaves to not be of equal status as themselves, only viewing them as property and not the human people they were. What happened on the Zong is where the name massacre came from, due to the tragic loss of lives on board. It showed the inhumanity of the transatlantic slave trade due to African lives being considered nothing more than cargo. An estimated 1.8 million enslaved people died on the ships that took them to the Americas. Many jumped off willingly as they felt that the life that awaited them was far worse than death. The Society of Friends was created following the Zong Massacre, a group that campaigned against slavery. 4 years later, the Society of the Abolition of the Slave Trade formed. which often used the Zong Massacre to highlight the mistreatment slaves faced. It was due to the efforts of these two societies that Parliament outlawed the Atlantic slave trade in 1807 and abolished slavery entirely in the British Empire in 1833. The United States discontinued bringing slaves from Africa in 1807 as well, but only outlawed slavery years later in 1865 during the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Despite these changes, the events of the Zong Massacre still remain in the forefront of people's minds today as a great tragedy, as countless lives were lost due to the exploitation of African people. Number 4. Barnett Davenport. On October 25, 1760, Barnett Davenport was born in New Milford, Connecticut. He grew up in the area with his parents and at least 6 brothers. As soon as he learned how to speak, Barnett grew comfortable using profanities and other bad language. At the age of 9, Barnett was sent away to live as a boarder with Mr. Nathan Hawley. At this time, children were often sent to be boarders at different houses when their parents were unable to afford their care. For Barnett, this might have occurred due to his many siblings, but certainly wasn't helped by the fact that he was a bit of a troublemaker. While living with Mr. Hawley, Barnett did not attend school, so he didn't learn to read or write. By age 11, Barnett ran away from Mr. Hawley after facing physical abuse at the hands of the man. He returned to his parents' house, but stole sweet corn from local fields before arriving to live with them again. While living with his parents, his short temper continued to develop as he internalized his emotions. When describing his childhood, Barnett often said he was treated harshly by his parents and the people who he boarded with. He began to steal watermelons from his neighbor's farm and bounced between his parents' house and boarding houses. Between the ages of 13 and 15, Barnett lived with 3 separate men who each took him in as a boarder. He didn't stay in any of these homes for long, as Barnett stole things from them such as hens, eggs, money, linens, and other goods he could easily sell. When he decided he no longer wanted to live with these men, he'd steal their horse and ride back to his parents' house. At age 15, while living with Mr. John Stillwell, Barnett plotted his first murder. While out in the fields gathering logs with Mr. Stillwell, Barnett picked up an axe while Mr. Stillwell had his back turned. Barnett planned to knock him out and chop him up, but got cold feet and was unable to go through with it. He stole Mr. Stillwell's horse not long after and fled. He soon returned to his father's a month later, where he continued to steal corn and watermelons from a neighbor's farm. Instead of returning to live as a boarder for another man, Barnett decided to enlist in the Massachusetts military. He planned to serve for 3 years and fought under Generals Benedict Arnold and George Washington, the latter of which would go on to become the first president of the United States. In fact, Barnett was present during the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga in March of 1777, where he remained until the fort was evacuated. His problems did not end when he enlisted. After growing angry with a fellow soldier, Barnett threw a club at him, which missed and hit an officer instead. After a strict punishment, Barnett and his fellow soldiers moved on to Albany, New York. After recovering from a brief sickness, Barnett was sent to Danbury, Connecticut in the spring of 1778 to keep guard for 2 months. While in Danbury, Barnett stole hens, geese, rum, and wine. He then traveled to Valley Forge in Pennsylvania to rejoin with General George Washington's army, all while stealing sugar along the way. He joined General John Patterson's brigade until they reached Woodbury, New Jersey that October. At this time, he was granted 1 day to go visit one of his brothers that lived nearby, but never returned to the army. Barnett visited his brother and then his parents back in New Milford, Connecticut, before bouncing between 4 different towns in as many months, unsatisfied with each place he lived. He was later hired by a man to serve in Captain Bovitt's company for 9 months back in Albany. Barnett traveled to Albany but quickly realized the man who had hired him made false promises regarding a pay bonus. Barnett tried to desert the company early on, but was caught and brought back to complete his service. While a part of the company, Barnett stole many belongings of his fellow soldiers, including shoe buckles and clothes. One day, after scouting a nearby house, an officer commanded him and some other soldiers to plunder the building. Barnett decided to set the house on fire after they had finished, which his commanding officer had not advised him to do. Once he was given 12 days of leave, Barnett stole a pair of silver shoe buckles and a horse before deserting the company. As he left the company to restart his life once more, Barnett stole pieces of clothing that he could resell. After living in New York State in November of 1779, Barnett moved to Washington, Connecticut. By then, he was 19 years old and had been generously taken in by flax farmer Caleb Mallory and his wife Jane. Barnett used one of his brother's names, going by Nicholas, in fear the company he had deserted would come and find him. Mr. Mallory took him in out of compassion and gave Barnett some proper clothing as his was worn and ragged. In January of 1780, Barnett plotted the murder of Mr. Mallory and his family at the first opportunity he had so that he could steal the valuables from the home. Barnett described the thought of murder plaguing him day and night, encouraging him to kill the family. Mr. Mallory's daughter was a tailor who often traveled away to work. Her sister-in-law, the wife of Mr. Mallory's son, Dr. Jonathan Mallory, decided to go visit her and stay the night, leaving Barnett the perfect opportunity to carry out his wicked urges. On February 3, 1780, Mr. Mallory's daughter-in-law left the house to meet up with Mr. Mallory's daughter, leaving Caleb and Jane with their 3 young grandchildren. After Caleb, Jane, and their grandchildren went to bed, Barnett searched the unoccupied rooms for valuables. Once he had finished, Barnett took a flax tool into the master bedroom and beat Caleb and Jane. This awoke 7-year-old Charlotte, who was asleep in the bed. She met the same gruesome fate as her grandparents. Barnett looted the master bedroom and found money as his benefactors lay dying in their bed. He changed into some of Caleb's clothes before going into the other bedroom, where John, age 5, and Sherman, age 3, were asleep. The 2 grandchildren had awoken from the sounds of the assault, but Barnett told them to go back to sleep and be quiet. Although they were crying, they listened to Barnett. After Barnett gathered as much loot as he could, he set multiple rooms on fire before fleeing the house. The 2 grandchildren he had left alive perished in the blaze. Once the house was on fire, Barnett left for Blue Swamp, located a few miles away, and arrived by the next morning. He stayed there for almost a week, assuming authorities would believe he died in the fire as well. But authorities had found everyone's body except Barnett's and concluded that he had been the one to start the fire. They tracked him down by the time he reached Cromwell, Connecticut, and arrested him. Barnett admitted to the murders as well as all other crimes he committed in his life in a 14-page confession. His brother Nicholas had been arrested as well, as Barnett had gained Nicholas a bad reputation from using his name. Initially, Barnett said he had an accomplice in order to get a lesser sentence, resulting in Nicholas receiving 39 lashings and life in prison. However, Nicholas was released 2 years later when Barnett admitted he acted alone and had received no help from his brother. In the early days of the continental United States, Barnett became the first documented person to commit mass murder. He was sentenced to 39 lashings and death by hanging. Residents of Litchfield County tied him to the back of a cart and paraded him around the Litchfield Green. Later that day, he was taken to Gallows Hill and hanged on May 8, 1780. Number 5. The Harpe Brothers. For this case, historical records were not as well documented, so there are some inconsistencies that will be addressed throughout this section. We researched and came up with what we believe to be the most accurate timeline of events. Shortly after the first documented mass murder, the first documented serial killers wreaked havoc on the southern United States. In 1748, Micajah Harpe was born in Scotland, followed 2 years later by his brother Wiley Harpe. This brought on their nicknames Big and Little due to how much larger Micajah was than Wiley. Although some documentation refers to them as being cousins instead of brothers, we will refer to them as brothers in this video and use their given nicknames. By 1763, Big and Little's family emigrated to what is now known as Orange County, North Carolina. Their family was assumed to be loyalists to the crown at the time, where tensions were developing between Great Britain and the colonies of America. Once they were old enough to leave their families and live on their own, Big and Little left North Carolina and began the journey to Virginia to take up jobs as slave overseers. However, their journey to Virginia was interrupted as warfare began in the colonies during the American Revolution. Instead of continuing on to become slave overseers, Big and Little decided to join a gang of loyalists, but seemed more interested in the violence and criminal activities that came with being in a gang than the political statement their fellow loyalists were trying to make. Some of the activities the Harpe brothers were known to enjoy participating in included burning farms, sexual violence against women, and looting homes of those that sided with the Patriots. It was at this time that Little Harpe and a group of other men attempted to kidnap 4 women back in North Carolina. However, a man named Captain James Wood came to the rescue of the woman and shot him. Little had only been wounded and was able to survive from the gunshot. In 1780, the Harpes joined the British Army to fight in multiple battles along the North and South Carolina border. They only stayed for a year before deserting the army to join a group of Cherokee natives that raided settlements in North Carolina and Tennessee. While with the Cherokees, Little sought revenge on Captain James Wood by kidnapping his daughter Susan and another woman named Maria Davidson. The 2 women were forced to become the wives of the Harpe brothers. The Harpe brothers left the Cherokees soon after their marriages, heading with a group of men and their kidnapped wives towards Tennessee. It was during this journey that the pair murdered one of the men who accompanied them, named Moses Doss, for taking too much of a liking to their wives. Once in Tennessee, the Harpe brothers settled in present-day Chattanooga, amongst another Cherokee village. They helped participate in the Battle of Blue Licks with the Cherokees and remained at the village for an additional 11 years. However, their lengthy stay did not make the Harpe brothers feel loyalty to the Cherokees, as they fled the village in September of 1794 after hearing a rumor that Americans were planning to attack the village without alerting the others. Instead, they settled in a cabin on the outskirts of Knoxville, Tennessee, by spring of 1797. That year, Little Harpe kidnapped a minister's daughter named Sarah or Sally Rice, making his kidnapped bride, Susan Wood, the shared wife of he and Big. By the next year, in 1798, the Harpe brothers began the murder spree that would earn them the title of first documented serial killers in the United States. Before moving back to Kentucky in December, the Harpe brothers killed 2 men in Tennessee. They were apprehended by law enforcement after being charged with stealing hogs and murdering one of the 2 men. They were able to escape from prison and continue towards Maryland to avoid the law, killing 2 more men that were traveling on the same roads. They had begun the practice of filling their victims' bodies with rocks before sinking them in nearby bodies of water. The brothers were motivated by bloodlust and not so much financial gain. Those that caught on to the Harpe brothers and tried to prosecute them often faced severe repercussions. After a traveler named John Langford was found dead on a road that led from Virginia to Kentucky. A local innkeeper accused the Harpe brothers of being behind him. The brothers were arrested and thrown in prison once again in Danville, Kentucky, but were able to escape. Before they left the area, the Harpe brothers murdered a young boy whose father was part of the posse that captured and arrested the brothers. Knowing there were 2 murderers on the loose, the governor of Kentucky issued a $300 reward for each of the Harpe brothers' heads by April of 1799. To avoid their fates, the Harpes, their wives, and 3 of their children fled north. Despite the hefty bounty on their heads, the Harpes killed 2 more men named Edmonton and Stump and wiped out a small camp of 3 men they found at the mouth of the Saline River in Illinois. When they arrived in southern Illinois, the Harpe brothers ended up joining Samuel Mason's gang, which consisted of river pirates that looted nearby boats along the Ohio River. They were known to be ruthless, but even they were appalled by the practices the brothers participated in. The Harpe brothers would kidnap travelers and take them to the top of the bluff, where they would be stripped naked and thrown down the bluffs to their deaths. After frequently killing travelers this way, the gang eventually asked the Harpe brothers and their families to leave and not return. Knowing it was in their best interest not to settle in Kentucky, the Harpe brothers took their families back to Tennessee, where they continued to murder those they came into contact with. On their journey, they murdered over 20 people, including a traveling family of 8 and a young girl. The one murder that Big Harpe later admitted to having remorse over was when he killed his infant daughter after she wouldn't stop crying. Big confessed that he had reacted out of habit, and only after the deed had been done was when he felt regret for his actions. The Harpes often sought shelter in inns or the homes of kind strangers, who were unaware of the crimes the brothers had been committing. While staying at the house of a man named Moses Stegall in Kentucky, the Harpe brothers killed another guest named Major William Love. Additionally, they killed Mr. Stegall's 4-month-old baby while the baby was crying. Mr. Stegall's wife witnessed the murder of her child, but was killed by the Harpes shortly after. The Harpe brothers decided to go west once more, trying to outrun a posse that had formed to claim the $300 reward. The posse had been following them since they had been traveling towards Illinois to join the river pirates. Finally, the posse caught up with the Harpe brothers in August of 1799, 4 months after the bounty had been placed on them. The Harpe brothers were preparing to kill a settler named George Smith, but were ambushed by the posse. The brothers fled on horseback and were able to escape, but Big Harpe had been shot in the leg and back. After catching up to them, Big was pulled from his horse and confessed to killing over 20 people as he lay dying on the ground. Historians believe that Big killed many more than the 20 he admitted to, but Big was unable to confess to all of them, as Moses Stegall cut off his head. Moses had grown enraged over the death of his wife and son, and joined the posse shortly after burying his family. Big's head was taken to a nearby crossroad and put on a stake, warning outlaws to stay away. Little Harpe had managed to escape and went back to rejoin Samuel Mason's pirate gang in Illinois. He began using the alias of John Seton to avoid being discovered. Not long after joining, a bounty was offered up for the head of Samuel Mason. Despite trying to lay low, Little Harpe and another pirate decided to cut off Samuel Mason's head and go collect the money. Instead, Little was recognized for his true identity and was arrested. After a brief escape from prison, Little was recaptured and sentenced to hang. In January of 1804, Little Harpe was hanged for his crimes, which ended the year-long killing spree that he and his brother Big had perpetrated. They are estimated to have killed over 40 men, women, and children. Their kidnapped wives had been abandoned during the initial ambush that killed Big Harpe. Each of the 3 wives had 1 child and were initially charged with being involved with the murders of Mrs. Stegall and her newborn son, but were found not guilty in a trial. Susan Wood, the shared wife of the Harpe brothers and daughter of Captain James Wood, stayed in Tennessee until her death. Sarah Rice, the wife of Little Harpe, returned to Knoxville to live with her minister father. She went on to marry a respected man and had a large family. And Maria Davidson, who often went by Betsy Roberts, married a man in 1803 and moved to Illinois before dying in the 1860s. The years of trauma that the woman faced most likely lived on with them for the rest of their lives.
If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe. For notifications of any channel updates, hit the notification bell. We hope you enjoyed this video and we'll see you next time.